Hi, I'm Wendy Turner, Executive Director of Michigan Public. You might have heard that public media is under threat. You're not wrong. But I come to tell you that your voice has power. Visit protectmypublicmedia.org, contact your lawmakers, and take a stand today.
From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
For the first time in a decade, there is an open Senate seat in Michigan.
With longtime Democratic Senator Debbie Stabenow retiring, there is no incumbent running this year.
It is a seat that will help determine the makeup of the U.S. Senate. The race between Democratic Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin and former Republican Congressman Mike Rogers is, according to polls, a toss-up. And the two met last night for the first of two Senate debates before November.
For the Republicans who feel like their party has left them over the last few years, you will always have an open door in my office.
My opponent has voted 100% with the Biden-Harris agenda. 100%.
We are going to spend the show today with Chad Livengood, politics editor at the Detroit News, and Emily Lawler, politics editor at the Detroit Free Press, talking all things Michigan's open U.S. Senate seat. Hey, you two.
Thanks for having us.
Hey.
So, Emily, there was a lot of debate about whether or not we would even see a debate in this Senate race. We did. What did you take away?
We did and we will. You know, the bones of what we saw last night are two strong candidates for a seat, both with a lot of experience, both with a lot of background, particularly related to some national security issues. And certainly it's a race where we've got two really qualified people running on really established records.
Chad?
I thought that Mike Rogers showed, he has lots of experience in Congress and years of dealing with major issues. And then Elissa Slotkin also showed that she's got a lot of background that, not your average U.S. Senate candidate has. Rogers handled himself quite well in taking some of the digs, especially the Florida comments that she would make about you were in Florida.
We're talking about where his house.
Yes, where he lived for a few years until he moved back to Michigan in order to run for this seat. And so he kind of took those digs in stride. He kept coming back obviously with this rehearsed line of, in the CIA, you were trained to be deceptive, and it appears you're trying to do this to voters as well. She also didn't take the bait as well. She also stayed on message, trying to focus on his record and coming at him on a couple of high points, particularly as it relates to his votes on Medicare and healthcare votes in Congress.
We will talk a little bit about the sort of where Mr. Rogers is living, which is making a lot of news this week. But let's first dig into some of the issues and policies that made up the debate. Let's start with China. Chinese businesses have become a big part of the narrative of this Senate campaign. If you have been following the race, you have likely seen many an ad hearing about quoting, Chinese influence, non-disclosure agreements, and a company called Goshen. Let's take a listen here to Mike Rogers from last night.
The incorporation papers from this company clearly show it is affiliated and must abide by the Chinese constitution, including their CEO, who is a senior member of the Chinese Communist Party. And we knew this was going to be a problem. Matter of fact, Congresswoman Slotkin's former boss, Leon Panetta, said this will be used for espionage activities. There's no doubt in my mind why they're bringing Chinese engineers on here to Michigan.
Chad, what is going on here?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but starting with the attack on Goshen. Goshen is a company that has a U.S. subsidiary based in California for the last decade that is a U.S. subsidiary of the Chinese parent company. This is very, very common corporate structure where China or Japan or Germany set up a U.S. subsidiary that is sometimes completely controlled by the mothership and sometimes has other partners. Goshen Inc. in the U.S. has a third investment by Volkswagen, German automaker, and a third investment by Americans. And so, but it is inherently a Chinese battery maker. They want to build this $2 billion plant essentially in scrubland north of Big Rapids, pretty rural area. It's been a very, very big, shocking, huge development to come to Big Rapids or attempt to come to Big Rapids. It caused a huge political firestorm locally. They voted out the entire township board there in Green Township. And what's happened is Republican politicians have seen this as an as something that they can latch on to, and they've held rallies at a horse farm north of the site where they want to build this plant. Both J.D. Vance has held a rally. Mike Rogers held a rally. The thing that you're not hearing from when Mike Rogers goes after the Goshen or Chinese investment in general, this is not new. I mean, Rick Snyder, a Republican governor, went to China, came back and said, look at all this investment I got from Chinese businesses, automakers. There's a couple of Chinese automakers that have set up R&D facilities in Metro Detroit because guess what? We have the biggest concentration of automotive engineers in the world.
And Rick, I'm thinking so much historically speaking about the role that China has played actually in Senate races in the past, right? Chad mentioned Rick Snyder. That, of course, was a governor. But I'm thinking like Pete Hoekstra against Debbie Stabenow. What do you make of this?
Well, I do think that it's a Republican value proposition that depending on the election cycle, a lot of Republicans, like a lot of progressive Democrats, in fact, are skeptical of government support, government subsidies for projects like this. And then on top of that, in this particular case, as Chad astutely pointed out, that Goshen has strong connections to the Chinese Communist Party. And so there are now national security concerns baked into the controversy as well. And let's not forget that, this Michigan versus Asia controversy dates back decades when, we saw Japanese automakers building more affordable vehicles than what we were seeing in the United States. And so I think there's also kind of that cultural question baked into it as well.
Yeah. So immigration also talked about the economy and inflation, of course, but abortion remains on the top of many voters' minds. Let's take a listen here from last night. First, from Elissa Slotkin.
I did not support overturning Roe v. Wade. And if a bill came in front of the U.S. Senate to codify Roe, I would vote for it. But I think this is a really important distinction between the two of us. Mike Rogers was 20 years as a legislator. He voted for every single ban, every restriction, every bill that came across his desk to make it harder for a woman and to ban, in some cases, a woman and her right to choose. 56 times in total. We checked the math. To me, every single time he was casting one of those votes, he was saying something very particular. He was saying to women, he does not trust you.
And now here is Mike Rogers.
I have come out and talked about making sure that IVF is available for families so they can grow their families.
Now,
It's a very personal thing for these families, and I support it 100%. What she's saying is, I don't trust you people of Michigan. She wants to go back to Washington, D.C. and put our vote in Michigan at risk with the rest of the country.
Emily, what do we understand about where Elissa Slotkin and Mike Rogers stand on the issue of abortion and reproductive rights?
Well, I think that Elissa Slotkin falls in line with a lot of Democrats this cycle who would like to talk about it as much as possible, frankly. I think that in 2022, we saw abortion be a winning issue, garnering 57% of the popular vote here in Michigan for a constitutional amendment. And we've seen candidates in Michigan and nationally sort of want to carry that momentum into the 2024 election. So I think that Democrats think they have a winning message here, and it's been proven certainly in states like Michigan, where the general population has agreed with the Democratic position on abortion. And, Mike Rogers is in the position a lot of longtime Republican politicians are in, which is, there was a lot of talk about when Roe v. Wade got overturned, sort of Republicans being the dog that caught the car, right? And I think that there's been a lot of fallout from that, both electorally and also just culturally. I think that viewpoints on abortion have shifted pretty drastically. I think that when the national protection to abortion as a right went away, a lot of people started looking at the issue pretty differently. And Mike Rogers, like any pro-life Republican, who's been around politics for 10, 15, 20 years, has a really strong record on abortion that's, definitely had to change, I think, in light of Roe v. Wade being overturned. We see a lot of Republican candidates now saying it's best left to the states. Michigan's already protected it. It's already in the Michigan Constitution, and treating it as sort of a moot issue while Democrats are trying to keep it active.
We'll see how long voters' memories are on this, because for the longest time, Republicans and people who are aligned with the pro-life cause were able to argue that, well, because of the Roe v. Wade decision, that abortion as an existential question was off the table. And then the Dobbs decision came along, and like you said, that Republicans were kind of in this position of being the dog that caught the car. And so now they're facing the same question again, and the retort is, well, it seemed like it was settled once before. And, you can try and hang your belief on that, on the Michigan constitutional amendment, but we know that things can change regardless of how settled they may seem in any particular moment.
That's Rick Pluta. I am Zoe Clark. You're listening to It's Just Politics, and we are joined with Emily Lawler, politics editor at the Detroit Free Press, and Chad Livengood, politics editor at the Detroit News. So let's take a listen to one other question from last night's debate. We will hear first from Rick Albin, the moderator.
The question is, Congressman Rogers, is there a red line that Israel could cross that would lose your support?
I think one of the big problems if people have been trying to be on both sides of this issue, we could have a ceasefire tomorrow if Hamas would give up the hostages. We have 4 Americans still there. Those Americans should be brought home. They were dragged out of their homes viciously on October 7th, dragged into the tunnels of Gaza. Right. So I think that right now, what we should do is support Israel getting this piece right, frame out a ceasefire based on getting the hostages out first.
And then here's Elissa Slotkin.
Still extremely raw. It's very personal here in Michigan, where people of all stripes have real personal connections to the region. For me, it's clear we need a ceasefire deal that brings the hostages home. Israel has the right to defend itself when people come and kill their citizens, rape women, shoot ballistic missiles at them. That is something that any country in the world has the right to do. But we can also say that we don't like seeing loss of life among civilians.
Chad, what should we understand about what we just heard here?
I think Mike Rogers' stance is pretty firm in that he's going to stand behind Israel. Elissa Slotkin has a much tighter rope to walk, and it's very similar to the one that Kamala Harris has to walk with Arab American voters, a key Democratic constituency in Southeast Michigan. People of Arab and North African descent total more than 300,000 in the population. And so this is a known constituency, and in a very narrow election could very well tip the scales if they sit out. We know what happens when tens of thousands of people sit out a presidential election. We saw this when we had over 75,000 people not vote in the presidential election in 2016, and then Donald Trump wins by 10,704 votes. So there is a lot of tiptoeing going on right now on the Democratic side, and Elissa Slotkin is trying to thread a needle of, I'm pro-Israel, but I'm also pro-Palestinian families, and don't think that we need to have endless carnage. Let's get a deal together. And of course, she would love to see a ceasefire before November 5th, but we're running kind of low on days here to achieve that.
Emily, we've just got a few minutes left. As we talked about at the very beginning of the show, questions are being asked about just where Mike Rogers lives. Can you give us a quick background about what's going on here, and what is the latest that we know?
Yeah, well, Mike Rogers spent some time outside of Michigan. You mentioned Florida, maybe a reverse snowbirding of sorts. Moved back to Michigan, but his exact address has been sort of an open question. So my colleague Emma Elric recently had a column and investigated his residence and found some discrepancy between the house that he was registered to vote at, which is a new house that he's having constructed, that address being used for voter registration, but not having a certificate of occupancy. It sounds like the city hasn't fully hooked it up yet.
Mike Rogers, in his own Senate primary in August, voted from an address he could not legally live at. Literally did not have a sewer hookup. He cannot live in this house, which I put eyes on yesterday for our reporting, and it's still got a portage on outside, and it's still got an unfinished deck. But nonetheless, what his campaign acknowledges that he's living with a relative in White Lake Township. And then they trotted out Eric Doster, the Republican attorney, who said, well, technically he's still a legal voter because he was in the same township. And so they're trying to shoot down any suggestion by Democrats that Mike Rogers committed some kind of voter fraud, essentially. And so now whether this becomes a issue in the final weeks, I mean, Slotkin didn't bring it up in the debate last night, but she's been living outside of her district, and she also one time rented a condo from a lobbyist, and that was a really messy story. And so she's had some of her own housing issues and carpetbagging claims to have to deal with. So how they want to approach this will be kind of interesting.
Is this going to become an issue that it seems like Democrats are really trying to push?
I mean, I think constitutionally, the only requirement is that he be a resident of the state of Michigan to run for office. I think that he is a resident of the state of Michigan. I haven't heard, a big pushback to that specifically. Certainly, he's doing campaign events and rallies and popping up all over the state right now. But, I do think there's some question, especially for someone who's, routinely talking about vote integrity and recently implied that he thought there might be some shenanigans in Southeast Michigan with the vote in November. I do think it's a question as to whether his own registration is shipshape.
Yeah, there were a couple of Florida references in the debate last night. So, Chad, really quickly, your paper has new poll results on the Senate race just out this week. From that, what do we extrapolate about where this race stands right now?
Our polling showed Slotkin leaving by about 3.5 points, and this is down from she had about an 8.5 point lead back in at the end of August after the Democratic National Convention. So, I mean, this race is tightened, and that might be as much of a result of Rogers started bringing home Republicans, because back in late August, he was only polling like 72% of Trump's voters, and now he's got 85% of Trump's voters.
But she's making hay with independents.
She is making hay, and she made some significant hay in turning it around with independents. And so, I mean, obviously there is a multi-million-dollar ad war going on right now, and that's influencing how people are starting to break here. But there are still our polling suggests there are still maybe about 5% undecideds, whereas in the presidential elections like less than 1%.
Yeah.
I mean, if you haven't made up your mind over Trump and Harris, you're probably not going to vote. But in the Senate race, there still seems to be up for grabs here.
A Senate race still up for grabs, and still a final Senate debate between these two candidates next week. That is Chad Livengood, politics editor at the Detroit News, Emily Lawler, politics editor at the Detroit Free Press. Thank you two so much for your brains.
Thanks for having us.
Anytime.
And a reminder to get all of your political fill and all of the news out of Michigan elections. Sign up for the new It's Just Politics newsletter. Drops in your inbox every Friday afternoon. Find the link to the sign up at michiganpublic.org. And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.